Carranza, meanwhile, in Coahuila, was also part of this larger constitutionalist army, but rather than seizing lands and then renting them out, as Pancho Villa did to generate revenue to pay for his army, Carranza mostly floated bonds. What that means is that he continued to borrow, print, and issue paper money. Now, Pancho Villa, who had a much more popular army than Carranza, was his aim to take the land back and give it to the peasants? Maybe, maybe not. It always seemed like Villa was going to return the land later on, when the revolution was over. He did use the land to generate revenue, which he then used to pay soldiers, but this is not the primary purpose here. The primary purpose for Pancho Villa was to create an army of soldiers who would be paid a wage for fighting. So what we have then are the constitutionalists. They're challenging the dictatorship of Huerta for the leadership of Mexico. And then the United States gets even more involved. Now, Woodrow Wilson, once again, he was an idealist. He believed that democracy should flourish in Mexico. And just like Americans were not hesitant to use the military to back up their financial interests around Latin America, they were all, under Woodrow Wilson, they were also willing to use the military to achieve aims that they thought were democratic. So, interestingly, the United States, in their intention to ensure democracy and remove a dictator from power, violated the sovereignty of Mexico by sending Marines into Veracruz. Marines bombed Veracruz. A lot of people died. And everyone in Mexico, from Huerta to Carranza to Pancho Villa to Obregón, all of the generals involved in the civil war raging in Mexico, they were all very upset at the United States for intervening. Woodrow Wilson had intervened because he didn't want to see Huerta continue in charge, but of course, by intervening, he tremendously upset the people who in Mexico who saw that as a violation of a violation of Mexican territory. Huerta, Villa, Carranza, none of them appreciated the violation of Mexican sovereignty. Carranza denounces the U.S. intervention. He doesn't call it an invasion because, of course, Carranza is going to want support from the United States as well. Even Emiliano Zapata, who hated Huerta, who has been in a death struggle against Huerta ever since the election of Madero, even he says that if any Americans show up in Morelos, the Zapatistas will fight them. See, one of the other effects of the Mexican Revolution is that all these people find together in armies together. They kind of, they travel around the country. They become more national. They begin to think of themselves more as Mexican rather than being from one part of the country. But another thing, so that leads to nationalism, this idea of what it means to be Mexican. But also what it means to be Mexican is to be opposed by the United States, to be challenged by the United States. An important part of Mexican nationalism is based upon, anti-gringoism, anti-Americanism, right? And this is especially emergent during the Mexican Revolution because the United States sends troops into Mexico not once, but actually 2 times during the Revolution. Whatever side you were fighting on in the Revolution, it was tremendously disappointing to see the United States get involved. But nevertheless, by getting involved, by sending in Marines, this fundamentally challenges the legitimacy of Huerta. And at last, at the Battle of Zacatecas in 1914, Huerta is defeated and he resigns. So, Huerta is now out of the picture. Who will emerge as the winners? Well, we have Zapata, we have Carranza, we have Pancho Villa. Pancho Villa and Zapata, once Huerta is defeated, they come into Mexico City first. Pancho Villa brings about 30,000 soldiers with him. Zapata, meanwhile, has about 15,000 soldiers. But these are rural people. There's these famous images of Emiliano Zapata and Pancho Villa meeting in the town of Xochimilco, just south, in what is today Mexico City. That's the only time they ever met. The truth of it is, both Zapata and Villa were pretty uncomfortable in Mexico City. They were both rural folks. Pancho Villa was a rancher from Coahuila. Zapata was a horse trader and a leader of peasants from Morelos. These weren't city folk. And in fact, one of the most famous pictures from the Mexican Revolution also is this instance where some of Zapata's men, these peasants who had taken up arms, go into a fancy restaurant in Mexico City, Sanborns. You can actually find them all over the country of Mexico today. But you can see these country folks being served chocolate by the very well put together and formal wait staff at Sanborns. It's a wonderful picture that demonstrates the absolute clash of cultures experienced by Mexicans during the Mexican Revolution, as people from all over the countryside, came together and started encountering each other for the first time, really, in the history of Mexico. But both Zapata and Pancho Villa were very uncomfortable in Mexico City, and they both left, which allowed Venustiano Carranza, the leader of the Constitutionalists, to come into Mexico City to capture it alongside Obregón. Most people kind of thought that the war was over at this point. Zapata, he goes back. The land is, the land is, which is divided up, is formally given to his soldiers, and they demobilize. Villa, however, goes up back north, and he returns to his army, and he doesn't stop fighting. And in fact, despite the fact that Carranza now claims himself as the president of Mexico, and what his army, his faction is called the Constitutionalists, practically they're carrying forward the Madero plan, except they got guns. Think of Carranza as Madero with guns, right? What they want are these reforms, political reforms, driven by middle-class desires to make Mexico more democratic. What does that mean? Open up Mexico for elections so that people who have traditionally not had any access to power in Mexico can now have access to power. The Constitution will limit the power of the presidency and end the threat of dictatorships in Mexico. That is the aim of the Constitutionalists. Well, in any case, Villa, Zapata, and others are quickly dissatisfied, take up arms again, and the fighting continues in what historians refer to as the War of the Winners, as Carranza, Villa, and Zapata, who had all allied together to fight against the dictatorship of Victoriano Huerta, now find themselves fighting amongst one another for the leadership of Mexico. Pancho Villa returns to the north, and in fact, it looked like Pancho Villa might be the victor of this whole thing. He had such a large popular army. He was tremendously popular both in Mexico and in the United States. I mentioned last time, Hollywood is just getting started at this point, but those movie directors love going down to Mexico, capturing film of Pancho Villa, much of which survives to this day. Pancho Villa was an extraordinarily popular figure, but perhaps his army was not quite as professional as the extremely well-funded and polished army of Venustiano Carranza. Now, Carranza also had in his army a man named Obregón. Obregón was from the north of Mexico, from a state called Sonora, and Obregón may have been one of the greatest fighters, greatest generals during the Mexican Revolution, and he went to war alongside Carranza against Pancho Villa. Now, Pancho Villa was a cowboy. Most of his soldiers were cowboys. That means that they relied upon cavalry, which was very effective in the first part of the Mexican Revolution. But something was happening in the world at this point. World War I. And World War I was characterized by this trench warfare, where soldiers would dig in, create a no-man's land between them and the enemy, and really they wouldn't be able to cross over this no-man's land. The trench warfare allowed them to turtle in position and take out anybody who attacked them. Particularly ineffective at dislodging soldiers from their trenches, cavalry. Horses with men charging at the trenches would just be cut down by the soldiers with machine guns from the trenches. Unfortunately, Pancho Villa did not learn this lesson. The Battle of Celaya, the troops of Obregón dug into trenches. Pancho Villa and his cavalry rushed at those trenches, and they were all shot down by the machine guns. Pancho Villa was defeated. And whatever hopes Pancho Villa might have had for leading the revolution, they are now dashed. Pancho Villa goes back to Chihuahua. He starts to lose his army as they generally drift away because Villa does not seem to be winning anymore.
En 1915 Jueves Santo en la mañana salió Villa de Torreón a combatir a Celaya.
Villa does have one last trick up his sleeve, though. One last trick up his sleeve. What he does is he puts a small raiding force together, crosses the border from Chihuahua into New Mexico, goes a few miles into the interior of the United States, and attacks this tiny, tiny little town, Columbus, New Mexico. You know, a few people were killed. They burned the town. It's a teeny, teeny little town. No one had ever heard of it. Why did Pancho Villa attack it? It certainly wasn't for, military reasons. It wasn't for anything except to try and gain some of his reputation back. Because the United States, despite this weird attack on this tiny little place in the middle of nowhere, well, nevertheless, Mexicans had invaded American territory and attacked an American town and killed a few American citizens. So the United States could not bear this insult, and they sent a group of soldiers under General Blackjack Pershing, who would go on to win, a great reputation during World War I. They sent him into Mexico to attack to capture Pancho Villa. Pancho Villa was portrayed as a bandit or maybe even a terrorist, but since he attacked the United States, that's tremendously popular in Mexico. And then the fact that these soldiers go into Mexico to try and chase down Pancho Villa, and they're ultimately unsuccessful, makes Pancho Villa even more popular because the Mexicans hate being invaded by the United States. Right? And in fact, the United States trying to capture and punish Pancho Villa, a guy who had actually always kind of liked the United States and been very friendly with Americans, this kind of turned Pancho Villa into a hero. Corridos were written about him, songs were written about him, celebrating how he was able to, pester the United States, and then they sent soldiers to catch him, and they could never actually get him. Even Carranza, who was looking for support of the United States and hated Pancho Villa and was engaged in a war against him, had to denounce this invasion when the United States sent troops in to try and attack Pancho Villa. Ultimately, Wilson removed the troops because they couldn't capture Pancho Villa, but also because Wilson hoped to keep Mexico as an ally, even as they went to war with Germany in World War I. Relations between Mexico and the United States, they remained cold. And in 1917, when Carranza received a telegram inviting them to attack the United States from Germany promising that they would give them Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, and California if Mexico were able to attack the United States and coordinate a victory against them. And for Germany, Mexico wisely refused. They knew that the chances of them being successful in attacking the United States were a very long shot indeed, and they risked alienating any support from the United States. But nevertheless, the fact that the United States invaded Mexico twice during the Mexican Revolution, did result in pronounced nationalism on the part of Mexicans following the war. But nevertheless, despite the fact that he became a hero and regained his reputation for fighting the United States and then escaping from the U.S. Army sent in to capture him, Pancho Villa was militarily defeated. Ultimately, Carranza's faction emerges as the victorious faction in this war.